Whether we like it or not, the fact remains that death is an inescapable phenomenon that we will have to face sooner or later. There's no point in denying it. It is impossible to cancel death. The Dalai Lama said in August 2012 that people are afraid of death, and this is a paradox. They live as if they are immortal, as if they will never die. But according to statistics, 2 people die every second on the planet, and in about 105 years, the world's population will be completely renewed. This means that none of the living will be alive by the year 2125. How can we be so sure that death will happen to anyone but us? We live as if we will live forever. But we know for sure that the body will die. It seems that the idea of eternal life is inherent in man from the beginning. Perhaps we feel that the body is just a temporary garment, an outfit that we use for certain purposes. The fear of death is usually associated with the unknown. People don't know what happens after death. They don't have an understanding of what lies beyond the line, and it scares them a lot. Nevertheless, this theme is revealed in various ancient traditions. It describes what happens after death. And if there is knowledge, then death becomes a more understandable process. For example, Vedic knowledge says that death is a process consisting of 4 stages, which are often compared to the 4 stages of birth. These steps are identical. Moreover, the Vedas state that there are 4 kinds of suffering in this world: birth, illness, old age, and death. Birth brings the greatest suffering. Getting sick, getting old, and dying are not as scary as being born. To understand this, we need to understand how a person works, including all his energy bodies. The knowledge of science does not allow us to reveal this topic, so we will rely on the more ancient Vedic teachings that are present in the cultures of many peoples of the world. Almost all of this knowledge, in one form or another, says that in addition to the gross physical body with which we usually associate ourselves, there is a subtle energy informational body that is our psyche. This body consists of 3 components: the mind, the intellect, and the false ego. The mind is a subtle mental structure that collects information from the senses and acts on the basis of this information. The mind works according to the principle of like-dislike. If man were guided only by this principle, he would be no different from an animal. But humans also have intelligence. This is a more subtle structure, which in turn is guided by the principles of right and wrong, good and bad. Above the intellect is an even more subtle structure called the ego. This is our identification with who we think we are. In our context, there are 2 answers to this question. Either we are the body, or we are something more. Either we live as a body, or as an eternally living being. We often say that we have a soul, but it is more accurate to say that we have a body. In this case, we associate ourselves with the soul. The truth is that we are not a body that experiences spiritual practice. We are originally spiritual beings who gain the experience of being in the material world. Above the false ego, there is an even more subtle energy that transcends the material. This is our consciousness, the energy of the soul. Based on this, we get that the soul is, as it were, in a shell. She is wrapped in our ego, intellect, and mind, and all of this exists in our physical body, like a Russian doll Matryoshka. So what happens when we are born? The soul, in the shell of a subtle body, comes into contact with coarse matter, a fertilized egg. Then the soul falls asleep for 3 months, enters an unconscious state. After that, she wakes up and lives her whole life for the remaining 5 to 6 months. If by fate we are supposed to be 70 years old, then in this state we perceive these 5-6 months as 70 years. We live in this space as in a dream, and the quality of this dream, the quality of a small life, depends on the physical and emotional state of the mother. This means that we are already getting some kind of experience before we are born. But let's return to the stages of birth and death, of which there are 4. The first stage of birth is oceanic. This stage ends when labor pains begin. Labor pains have begun, but the birth canal has not yet opened. This stage, when the world is collapsing and what to do is not yet clear, is called the apocalypse. It continues until the birth canal opens. Then the third stage begins, the light at the end of the tunnel. The child passes through the birth canal. The fourth stage is when we have already been born, but the birth has not yet been completed. A certain period of time must pass during which the child lives his predetermined life, with one day corresponding to 1 year. If, for example, you are destined to live 70 years, then this stage will last 70 days, and it is called liberation. The Vedas mention that a mother, watching a child during this time, can read his fate. During this period, the child is in a vulnerable state. Only after this period is the birth considered to be finally completed. When the birth process is completed, death begins. What we consider to be our life is just the first stage of death. Already at the level of the cell structure, it can be understood that each cycle of cell division is accompanied by a process when a small piece of telomere is cut off from the chromosome. Thus, the process of aging and death is started. Every body is programmed for a certain period of its life. And now let's move on to the most interesting part. Consider the 4 stages of death. The first stage is our whole life. Then comes the very moment of death, and the Vedas describe how this happens. At first, a living being feels a strong heaviness in the whole body. The muscles stop obeying. Then the body begins to cool down, and suddenly it enters a state of sudden heating. It is at this moment that the separation of the subtle body from the gross physical body takes place. This separation is accompanied by the fact that the senses of a living being detach from the senses. Vision ceases to perceive through the eyes, hearing through the ears. A living being naturally falls into a state of isolation, darkness, and sensory deprivation. This condition lasts from a few seconds to several hours. Then the living being sees a bright flash of white light and falls into oblivion for a while. After that, it comes to its senses and realizes that it is still in the same room. Let's now call a living being a soul. The soul sees everything, hears everything, realizes and understands everything. The world is becoming brighter, more contrasting and expressive. The thoughts and desires of living people are now visible. The soul sees its body, which it considered itself, lying next to it. The connection with the body is interrupted. The body begins to collapse. The soul realizes that it is alive, but already outside the body, in a subtle body. She is there, she sees, hears and understands everything, but no one sees or hears her. This stage lasts for 9 days. That is why, after this period, it is customary to accompany the soul on a further journey. As we already remember, this stage is called the apocalypse. The world is destroyed, and where to go is still unknown. These 9 days, the soul is close to its relatives. It is very attached to them and cannot leave. It is worth noting that if you think about the deceased, according to the laws of the subtle world, he will be there in the blink of an eye. He hears, he understands everything. At this time, you can still talk to your soul, say goodbye, explain something, say what you didn't have time to say during your lifetime, and ask for forgiveness. He hears, he understands, you can even feel his presence. At the same time, the deceased sums up his life, wonders how he lived his life. As a rule, everyone experiences the same regrets and emotions at this moment. These are regrets about missed opportunities. Someone didn't allow themselves to love, someone wasn't honest with themselves, someone wasn't doing what they loved. Imagine how much regret the deceased must feel these days. All this lasts exactly 9 days. During these 9 days, he needs the help and support of his family. The behavior of loved ones greatly influences the future fate of the deceased. The traditional pattern of behavior includes tears, crying, and grief. However, there is another model, more conscious and dictated by knowledge. It is an understanding that a loved one has left and is now in a subtle body, and he needs help. Tears and grief make his situation worse. At this time, it is necessary to be collected and consciously support the deceased because it depends on the family what happens to him next. We need to take him on a long journey. There are certain things that need to be done. These are 2 different emotions and 2 approaches. In the first case, relatives cry more for themselves. They feel sorry for themselves because they have to go through grief. In the second approach, which is more conscious and competent, the bright emotion of separation manifests itself. Yes, he's gone, but we'll definitely meet, love and got because he's an eternal being, and I'm an eternal being too. He lived his life, his script, and I'm seeing him off. I'll help him. He can count on me. What should I do for 9 days? A living being undergoes a restructuring of the subtle body and psyche, which requires energy. This energy can come from two sources. The first source is when loved ones don't know what to do or how to behave in such situations. In such cases, energy is taken by force, which causes devastation, depression, and decline in relatives. The second source is when loved ones give this energy consciously. It is transmitted through food. Many peoples of the world have a tradition of commemoration. It's a kind of energy transfer method. Everything that is eaten and drunk at the wake transmits its subtle component in the form of energy to the departed. In many countries, there is such an ignorant tradition when the deceased is poured into a glass of alcoholic drink and put a piece of bread on top. The premise is correct, but the form is not. Just ask any priest if it's okay to do that and listen to what he has to say. There should be no alcohol in the subtle body because everything is perceived solely as energy, as the essence. What is the essence of alcohol? Of course, alcohol cannot carry positive energy. There should be no meat either. I don't think it's necessary to explain why. A living being was killed, which means it experienced emotions: anger, fear, irritation, pain. These emotions, as a subtle component of energy, remain in the meat. Thus, the transfer of subtle energy to the deceased is a process in which all these experiences are transmitted and experienced by them. Ideally, energy is transferred through live food. In different writings, approximately the same dishes are mentioned, which are brewed for commemoration. As a rule, it is boiled rice, which is seasoned with sesame seeds, curdled milk, or fruits and berries. If you ask a priest about this, you might be surprised. He will tell you the same thing. Such food is illuminated and presented to the deceased living being for 9 days. It is simply placed in front of the photograph, and the photograph in this case is used to tune into the energy of the deceased. On the 9th day, the shell of the karmic body develops, which connects a person's feelings with the outside world. At this point, a person ceases to perceive the outside world, and the third stage begins, called light at the end of the tunnel. This stage lasts for 40 days and is mistakenly commemorated on the 40th day after death. In fact, it is necessary to remember on the 40th day after 9, that is, on the 49th day. It is on this day that the subtle body collapses and the soul's attention sinks into its own mind. A person comes into contact with the material that he has accumulated over his life: emotions, desires, thoughts, fears, relationships. Everything that happened during his lifetime, he lives for 40 days on one of the channels. This channel is selected depending on the form that the soul will take in the next incarnation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead says that the color of the light at the end of the tunnel determines the future shape. The blue color defines the animal form, and the yellow color defines the human form. There are 8,700,000 species of life on planet Earth. The soul moves through this tunnel and comes into contact with the energies that man himself once created, experiencing them in the form of a dream. There may be symbols, metaphors, or images in this dream, good or not so good, depending on the accumulated energy. The meaning of this 40-day sleep is a kind of revision, conclusions, lessons, and work on mistakes. This forms a certain attitude towards the life you have lived. On the 49th day after death, the third stage ends, and the soul enters the fourth stage, the stage of liberation. She feels like an actor who has played his role and can rest before getting into a new shape. The scenario of the future life has already been formed. It has been forming all these 49 days, and the soul can see it. She can find out which country the incarnation will be in, who the parents will be, and what significant events will take place in her future life. This is a karmic scenario that a person will follow, but in certain situations they will always have the right to choose. This scenario depends on the person's state of mind at the time of death, on what he was focused on at the time of death, what he was thinking about. This is the starting point from which the entire future fate of the next incarnation is built. Within 9 days, the frame is being built, and in the next 40 days it is finally formed. The Vedic teachings say that what a person thinks about at the moment of death, he will receive existence. This is how it always happens. 4 stages of birth and 4 stages of death, and all over again. All this is caused by samsara, which is one of the central concepts in Indian religions. Each religion or philosophical school gives its own interpretations of the concept of samsara. In most traditions and philosophical schools, samsara is seen as an unfavorable situation from which it is necessary to get out. For example, in the Advaita Vedanta philosophical school of Hinduism, as well as in some branches of Buddhism, samsara is seen as the result of ignorance about one's true self. Under the influence of this ignorance, the soul or individual accepts the temporary and illusory world as reality. References to samsara and reincarnation are also found in early Christianity. Even in the modern interpretation of the Bible, references to reincarnation can be found. But is it possible to interrupt samsara? Of course, it is possible, and death is just a unique opportunity for this. All that is needed is to think only of God at the moment of death. If we think about God at this moment, we go to Him. But as you have already understood, the last thought is always sincere and real. This is a very powerful and formative thought, and it will not be possible to replace it with another one. In order to think only of God at the moment of death, you need to live it all your life. Dear friends, the material for this video is taken from lectures by psychologist Evgeny Koinov. Let everyone decide for themselves how close this point of view is to them. On this channel, I have set a goal to highlight as many different points of view as possible on perhaps the main issue of humanity. What awaits us after death? Write in the comments, what do you think about what you heard in this video? Dear friends, thank you for watching my video to the end. If you liked it, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you, and have a nice day.